making a joke, but the fact is this will pay off. This attitude of I want to learn is going to pay off in the long run. And I'm saying that as a university professor, I'm saying it as a dad, but I'm saying it just actually as a citizen who watches people trying to grapple with complex issues. And you know, the more you expose yourself to breadth of ideas, the better you're going to be able to do that. You're going to be able to tackle those complex issues. So what I want to do today, it's a little bit of a variant on the title that I gave. But what I want to do is to look at the tools that governments have for protecting the environment. Okay, you got that? The tools governments have for protecting the environment. Let me give you a couple of examples, just so we're on the same track. How about that it's illegal to spit gum in Singapore, right? What is gum? Spit on the sidewalk, it's littering, it's ugly, we don't like it. You might not appreciate this, but in the US, in the 1960s, we didn't have this sense that we don't throw things on the ground. And if any of you watch the depraved show Mad Men, which I dearly love, there's a scene where they're out in a picnic, and they're done with the picnic, and they pick up the blanket and they just shake it, and all the paper and all the litter goes all over the place. We don't do that anymore in the US. We have a different approach, and part of that was that we changed people's attitudes, and part of it was that we had better enforcement of regulation. Here in Singapore, it's done through regulation, largely. We don't spit gum on the sidewalk because there's a what? Fine. Big fine. A big fine. It's not a small thing, it's a big thing. How about a carbon tax, right? If we want people to reduce emissions, we tax carbon dioxide emissions. That's a tool the government has for protecting the environment. Now, what I want to do is to give you a sense of the breadth of the tools the government has and how we can organize our thinking about these tools and start to say, you know, this is a tool that you would use for that purpose, and here's a tool you might use for a different purpose. And when would it be appropriate to use each? We'll see how far we get with this. But at least I want to see if we can get an overview. But first, what I want to do is ask you about the environment. So you all perhaps have taken the environmental science class, or many of you have taken the environmental science class. You're involved thinking about environmental issues, perhaps, some of you at least. What are some environmental issues that we might be concerned about as citizens? Let me give you an example. I'm concerned about wetlands. I'm concerned about the loss of wetlands. Why? Because they're important for migratory birds. They're important breeding grounds for fish populations, and they're important buffers against flooding. So 3 good reasons I'm worried about wetlands loss. What would be some other issues we might be concerned about?
Air pollution.
Air pollution. Any particular kind?
Carbon dioxide.
Sure, carbon dioxide emissions, because we're concerned about global warming. And what was the end of the scope?
Gray and brown air smog.
Smog, good. Anything else? Particulate matters? Good. Deforestation, loss of habitat, and as well as loss of the capacity to regenerate oxygen. Good. Anything else? Yeah. Destruction of coral reefs. How are coral reefs being destroyed? Sorry? Overfishing. Pollution of waters. Good. And it actually relates back to? Yeah, because we have this cycle of carbon dioxide. Rising carbon dioxide increases the pH of the oceans, and the corals can't handle the higher, the lower pH, higher acidity. It's been a long while since I was in a laboratory. But yeah, and then just temperature, slight temperature changes with corals can cause problems. So, good. What else might we be concerned about? Yeah.
Acid rain.
Acid rain. So where are we mostly concerned about acid rain? Where do you hear about it most? In China, good. Okay, so in China and in the US, places where we have emissions in the western part of a large land mass, right? Because air currents predominantly flow west to east, and when they're released in the western part of the land, they fall in the eastern part. But it takes about a week for them, for sulfur dioxide particulates to fall. And so when we release them in Washington, D.C., I'm sorry, in Washington State, we're dropping them in the Midwest and the East. And so we have to pay attention to those specifics about the environmental problem. Anything else? Yeah.
Melting ice caps and rising sea levels.
Okay, melting ice caps and rising sea levels as a result of
global warming.
Of climate change, global warming, whatever we want to call it. Yeah, so those are going to have some very significant effects. Okay, so those are just some examples of the kinds of challenges that we face on the environmental front, right? So the question is, how do we know those are actually problems? Maybe that's just the state of the world. See, a problem suggests you're going to do something about it, right? So I'm old. That's not really a problem because I can't do anything about it. It's just the state of the world. I have 2 children. That's not a problem. That's the state of the world. I can't change that, right? Now, how do we know we have an environmental problem? It takes 2 things. You acknowledge there's an issue, and by it, there's an issue.
Something that needs to be fixed.
Okay, there's an alternative that we think might be better. We go, look at the environment. I don't like the fact that the polar ice caps are melting. It was better when they weren't. When ocean levels were at a particular level, it was better when they weren't. And then the second thing is that you can do something about it, right? It's not an environmental problem if you can't do anything about it. If all you, now, you might say, well, we can adapt. Okay, yeah, you can adapt. But the issue here is, how do we prevent environmental degradation? That's what I want to focus on. How do we prevent environmental degradation? And part of that is asking yourself, when do we prevent environmental degradation? And actually recognizing the difference between when do you do it and can it be done? And that there is a better state of the world. Okay, now I don't want to go too far down that path, but I want you to think about how you spot an environmental problem. The next question is, what is it that makes it a problem? Where did the problem come from? So we talk about, oh, we have environmental challenges, we have environmental problems. Why is it, where did it come from? Where did that environmental problem come from? Okay, people are causing them. People are causing these problems, which suggests maybe people could stop causing them, right? Okay, good. Why? Why are people causing these problems? Why don't we talk about the problem in the distribution of pencils or dresses or potatoes, right? Why is it we talk about there's an environmental problem, but we don't go, oh, somebody needs to do something about pencils? What's the difference? Sorry? Okay, so one thing is that the environment is something that affects all of us simultaneously. We don't go, look, this is my little bit of the environment, you guys back off. So it's a public good. What else? What else makes the environment issue particularly challenging besides the fact that we're all in it together in a way we're not with pencils, dresses, or potatoes? Okay, so its impact on us, its effect on us is profound. The stakes are really high. Good. There's one other issue I want to see if we can't get to.
There's almost nothing everything we do has some sort of impact on the environment.
Okay, good. It's complex. It's complex, and it's, there is so much that we need to know about the environment, about the things we can do, and how we can change our behavior and so on. Okay? Everybody, see, this is where I want to start. Now, let's go to this issue of the anthropogenic source of a lot of these problems. Why is it that people do things that are bad for the environment? And what is it we'd like to change?
Well, they do it for their own benefit, and
Okay.
you want to make it so that you can have your own benefit, but it's not hurting the environment.
Okay, excellent. So people think one reason we have environmental issues is that people say, I'm about to make a decision. Is this decision going to be good for me or bad for me? Will I be better off or worse off if I go this way or that way? What are we not thinking about?
Is it good for the environment?
Is it good for the environment? Is it good for our neighbor? So one of the problems is people, when they make decisions, just kind of don't care that much. Or at least they don't account that much for the effect that their decisions have on others. Okay, what else might cause us to make decisions that lead to unfortunate effects on the environment? By unfortunate, I mean effects that if everything was weighed out, as a society would say, don't do that. Excellent, excellent. So there's an issue here that people sometimes just don't understand the impact or the effect of their actions, right? And they go, oh, I don't know what to do. I guess I'll just leave the water running forever because, it doesn't really affect anybody and water's cheap and, or I'll flare this methane out this stack because, well, it's really cheap and who really cares anyway? I can't sell it. So, good. So just people don't know, the decision makers don't know what the effects are of their decision.
Finance. It might be financially cheaper to do something even though it's more harmful.
Good, good. And that kind of goes back to this first point, which is people make decisions in terms of how does it affect me without thinking, because it's, I'm going to do this because it's cheaper, right? The finances are there. And maybe I don't have the means to borrow to make investments in efficient equipment and so on. Good.
They think that whatever they're doing doesn't make a difference. So like, if they themselves just leave the water on, they go, oh, it's just one more person. It doesn't really make a difference.
Right, right, exactly. So you've got the person who goes, yeah, I'm just one person. It doesn't really have any effect. I'm 1 in 7 billion. How much difference could I make? And of course we have the problem that if we all do that, but it's perfectly rational as an individual to make that decision. The problem is if we all act perfectly rationally, we get a very irrational outcome for society. Okay. Why else might we not be attending to environmental problems?
Like the priority we place over other issues and like an apathetic attitude towards the environment.
Okay, so you've actually just mixed beautifully these first 2 points, which is one, priorities. My priorities are for me. I value the benefits to me more than I do to society. Though you might have been saying, actually food is more important than environment. And the fact is, those are tough decisions. And there's nothing magical about environmental quality. It might be perfectly rational, both from the individual and the societal standpoint, to sacrifice some environmental quality if it means you get to survive. So these are very difficult decisions to make. So am I willing to give up some environmental quality for being able to eat tonight? Yes. What else? Oh, uncertainty. So one of the things is, it's not just that the individual decision makers don't know something. It's that society doesn't know. We don't understand. So for a while, people were saying, oh, well, and if you go, is everyone here somehow connected to the US, some experience in the US? You kind of keep your pulse so you know that in the US, there's still debate. Is global warming really happening? Is climate change really happening, or is it a big hoax? I lead a summer program in Oxford, and I take my students around Cambridge, Oxford, and London School of Economics, and then over to Brussels. And one of the professors at London School of Economics, in responding to that question from one of my students, so how is there really climate change? Is it really happening? And he said, right, you're American. He said that the belief that climate change isn't a serious issue is one that Americans are uniquely afflicted with. In other words, only you really believe that. Now, I don't know how true that is, but certainly that was a European's perspective. But this idea that these are difficult things, and we don't even know on some of these issues. Is it an environmental problem? Can we prevent it? Do we have the technologies to prevent this? Can we reduce the costs? We need innovation. We need research. Are we doing enough of that? That's a problem, because if I invest in research and innovation, it's my money. But then you get to use it. As a selfish actor, I might not want to do that. If we all make that decision, that selfish decision, which is perfectly rational, then we don't get the innovation, the research, and so on that we need. So these are three different problems. I've laid this out, and perhaps if you could, I don't know whether there's going to be enough for everyone, and you can pass those back and you can do the same. But we have three fundamental problems here. The first one is we don't even know we have a problem. Now that's a real problem. We don't even know we have a problem. We don't know the science, we don't know the environment, or alternatively, alternatively, we don't have the kit, the gear, the techniques, the methods to help ourselves out of this in a reasonable way. So this is the idea that research and innovation, and here we'd be talking about technological innovation, is a kind of a public good. Now let me give you an example. In the US, our holy grail to get us out of our high emissions is a high efficiency automobile, right? We need higher efficiency automobiles. Now, that's a real problem when everyone wants to drive Hummers and Cadillacs and so on. But before we can get people into high efficiency automobiles, we need more, and they need to be more affordable. How do we get those? Research, engineering, innovation, new kit, new gear, right? Where does it come from? Well, it comes from the automobile companies. But they don't have an incentive to do. So what happens? The government steps in and says, we need to move them in the direction of more efficient automobiles because we don't have enough efficient equipment. Okay. So there's research and innovation. The second one is, actually we have lots of knowledge, but individuals don't know. So this says that we've got decision makers don't know. I'm probably going to make a mess of this. Decision makers don't know things they need to know. We need to get the word out. We need to change people's attitudes. We need to help people get new values, new priorities, right? So we've got that. That's the second problem. And then the third problem is people don't care. All the gear, all the kit. We've got all the knowledge. It's just people just don't want to do the right thing, right? And so we need to come up with a way of helping them address that issue. All right, now, do you take economics here? Is that one of the courses? Some of you, all of you, all of you?
Raise your hand if you're taking econ now or have taken it.
Yeah. Okay, so a few of you have taken it. It's an elective. Okay. So in economics, we talk about something called market failure. Now, what is market failure? It doesn't mean that there was a market and it failed. What it means is that we have this theory this theorem called the first fundamental, says basically, under certain conditions, the market will allocate resources efficiently, which is great news, because it means the government doesn't have to do anything. The government just steps back and says, go to it, the market will take care of everything, but the problem is that there are fairly restrictive assumptions before you get to that. First assumption, perfect information. Second assumption, no public goods, complete property rights. Third assumption, all goods, services, anything you value is traded in the market. Environment isn't traded. We don't have complete property rights. We don't have perfect information. And there's the problem. That's why we have environmental problems. Now, why am I telling you this when I'm talking about the tools of government? Because this is the very first thing you have to do when you say we have an environmental problem, the government needs to do something. And it's remarkable how often governments don't do this. I mean, the other day, or last month actually, I was invited to give a talk, a review, an assessment of the Singapore Blueprint for Sustainable Development. What they didn't tell me was that Minister Balakrishnan was going to be in the audience. He was right there. In fact, he introduced me, and I was, and I said, oh, and so I went ahead and gave my talk, and I was a bit relieved when I saw him partway through the talk. When I got to this point, he pulls out his iPhone and he starts taking pictures, not of me, of the slides, because he was thinking, this is really important. And by the way, I have a huge amount of respect for Minister Vivian. He is fantastic. One of the brightest men in politics I've ever met. And he, but he's taking pictures. And I thought, oh, well, that's probably a good thing. And then 2 weeks later, I was having lunch, just coincidentally, I was having lunch with the permanent secretary of the minister's ministry, right? The Ministry of Environment and Water Resources. And we were chatting. I said something before I really thought about the connection. I said something about the blueprint. He said, ah, yes, my minister was in the audience. I thought, oh, right, was. And he said, he shared with us what you said. And I thought, uh-oh. And he was just, you know, no positive, no negative, just very, very close to the chest. And I thought, and I said, well, really, all I was trying to do was not get in trouble. I just didn't want to be deported. And he said, again, no expression, well, you're still here. So apparently, you know, this message kind of worked. But this is innovation and research as a public good. This is, we need to address imperfect information. This is, we need to change people's behavior. They have what they need to know. They just need to have some push to change the way they behave. Okay? Now, that's the very first thing you have to do. The next question then, as we think, what are the tools of government? How might the government address a problem? The second thing you might ask is, well, what fundamental role will the government take in trying to address this problem? And I'd suggest that there's two fundamental roles. One is a passive role, and the second is an active role. Now, I'm going to concentrate on this one here. And by the way, when I say people don't care, I'm saying they don't have full incentives to internalize all of the costs of their decisions. Okay, I'm using economics speak now. But, so that's just shorthand for they don't actually bear all of the costs of the decisions they're making. So if we can then say the government goes down either a passive role or an active role. And it has to choose which one it's going to adopt. Now, what do we mean by a passive role? I want to see if I can illustrate this by talking about your not too recent memories, I'm sure. Some of you have siblings. I had 4 siblings. I was the youngest. Imagine how that worked out. So, 4 siblings. What happens? Your Aunt Millie shows up. She's got a box of candies, right? She says, I brought candies. And you say, thank you, Auntie, and you and your siblings, thank you, Auntie. That's very nice. And then the Auntie leaves, Aunt Millie leaves. And what happens? That's when the fur starts flying. Because you've got kids and a box of candy, and that doesn't work, right? What happens? Well, one of them starts stuffing the candy in his mouth as fast as he can. The other one, she takes it and she starts hiding it, and then forgetting that it's the, what happens? It's wasted. The resource, candy, is wasted. So what's the role of the parent? The parent steps in and goes, look, you guys work it out, right? Well, we know that's not going to work because they're stuffing and hiding and so on. So what's the next thing? It says, okay, here's the deal. You get 4, you get 4, you get 4, and this one over here gets 5 because she's my favorite.
Oh.
So, yeah. So, there it is. But what has the parent done? The parent has established a rule for operating by dividing it up. And now, each one can use it. Now, if I got strawberry and you got orange cordials, we can trade, right? Parent didn't say anything about that. But the first point here is that the parent established a set of rules, a set of entitlements. Each one of you is entitled to 4, except this one is my favorite, he gets 5. That's the entitlement. So down this roll, the government basically says, here are your entitlements. You get these rights, work it out from there. If there's a violation of those rights, we will have to adjudicate. Okay, we'll have to enter in. So, what are the kinds of tools? Now, if you flip your paper over, that didn't work. Only came out on one side. No problem.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think that.
No. Don't worry about it. Please, don't worry about it. Here's what I've got for you. This is this doesn't mean too much. Do you see what I've got on there? I have 3 categories, 1, 2, 3, with instruments, policy tools listed in each one. The one over here, this big long one, that's the 3rd one. People don't care. We have policy tools to respond to people don't care. And if you looked down this list, what you would see is a couple of policy tools called property rights and liability. Property rights and liability. The government says, we're going to just establish property rights, and we're going to let you work it out. Now, let me give you an example of that. You've got a factory, and you've got a laundry sitting next to each other. Factory, sooty, smoky. Laundry needs a clean environment because it hangs out the laundry to dry. This is in the old days. And what's the problem? Well, the soot from the factory comes over and makes a mess of the laundry. What do they need? So they start shooting at each other. No, they don't do that because that would really be destructive. That would be absurd. So what they do instead is they say, who's got the right? Who has the property right here? And if the laundry has it, then the laundry can say, you don't have a right to emit all this soot. We can stop you. And the factory says, wait a minute, we can clean up some, but we can't eliminate all of our emissions, all of our soot. And the laundry says, well, I could take some steps, but it would cost me, and I have the right to stop you. You're going to have to pay me, right? You're going to have to pay me. And they bargain, they work it out. That's the beauty of property rights. And that means the government only has to be involved at the beginning when it assigns the property right. Same thing with liability. The government says, look, we're not going to tell anyone what to do, but if somebody pollutes somebody else's land, they're going to have to pay. That's a liability law. And the court determines how much you're going to have to pay. That's a liability law. So the point here is that this is a role for the government. This is a role for the government that the government loves because it's very little involved. Or not every government loves this, I guess. But it means very little involvement for the government. If there's a big fight, a disagreement, then they go to court and the court provides adjudication. But these are property rights and liability rules. And then there's a lot of subtlety in this, but very broad. Now, the next point here is, why don't we do everything with property rights and liability? Why not? Because the environment's complex. And when you get to more complex problems where you don't have just one person releasing emissions, one person dumping on somebody else's property, but rather you have possibly several people releasing emissions and hundreds of people, thousands, even millions being affected by that pollution, bargaining doesn't work anymore. That's a mess. That's a full employment act for lawyers. That isn't going to work. So you need something where the government says, yeah, we're going to actually take a stronger hand in this. And so we're going to take a more active role. In fact, what we'll do is we'll set a goal for the environmental quality. We're going to say the environment needs to look like this, or we're going to try to move us to the level of environmental quality that we, representing you, think it should be. And so down this path, the government takes a more interventionist approach. And it says, we're going to use regulations. We're going to create incentives to change your behavior. We're going to try to guide you toward the kinds of decisions we want you to make, because it will be in the interest of the public as a whole. And we think the individual costs are justified, that the investments in protecting the environment are justified by the social benefit. Society as a whole can't bargain because there's just too many of us, but we're convinced that this is the right way to go. So this is the second dimension. This is the second dimension for trying to parse out these dozens and dozens of policy instruments. And what you might do, just take a moment to look at the second column, the longer column, and pick out one or two of those and just put them in your mind. Gee, that's an interesting one. What's your favorite policy instrument? Before you get too wrapped up in that, I want to move on to the next way that we parse these instruments. So we've got these instruments here, regulations, create incentives. And if you look at that list in the second column, you'll see that lots of them do that. And subsidies, taxes, regulations, government investments, and so on. Lots of these things do that. And the question is, how do we organize those remaining once we remove the ones that either are property rights, liability, or somehow closely related to them? How do we organize those remaining ones? And one way to think about it, have you guys heard of environmental taxes? You know what that is? Do you hear talk about marketable allowances? So in the U.S., we hate taxes, right? Just culturally, politically, if you want to commit suicide, you go, hey, I think I'll put a tax on gasoline, right? It's automatic out. Now, what do we do instead? We use marketable allowances. Sulfur dioxide. You mentioned sulfur dioxide emissions at the very beginning. Do you know how we how we regulate sulfur dioxide emissions in the US? Do it with marketable allowances. We go, look, we only want this much sulfur dioxide emissions in the US. We're going to give away all of these allowances, but that's it. If you have an allowance, you get to emit. If you don't, too bad. But if you want to emit, you don't have an allowance, go and buy one. Maybe it's more valuable to you than to somebody who holds one. So marketable, we can go out and buy. So that's another kind of a policy instrument. The question is, how do we organize among all of these different kinds of policy instruments that are left after you remove these two types? And I'd suggest that the next two things you could do to think about this is to ask two questions. Who decides, who pays? And then if you do that, you move a long way toward organizing that mess in the second column. By the way, I should tell you where that mess came from. I went through dozens of academic articles from economics, from political science, from public administration, all of these that purported to provide typologies of policy instruments. And I just made a dump of all of the ones. And so all of the ones that are in standard are out of economics, in standard type, and all of the bold are the ones that were in political science and public administration that weren't in microeconomics articles. So all it does is it says, yeah, the microeconomics picks up a lot. The public administration, political science have a kind of a different view. So, who pays? And who decides? Now, what do we mean by that? So, who decides? Who decides whether you're going to spit gum in Singapore? You, the Singapore government. The Singapore government has pretty much decided. There's not a lot of room for negotiation. Very few of us, in fact, virtually none of us would go, yeah, it's worth $500. I'd go spit gum. Right? We just don't do it. Who decides whether you're going to use gasoline or not? You. The Singapore government has influenced that decision by putting a tax on it. But ultimately, it's left it up to you. There's neither criminal or even moral disapprobation of you using gasoline. It is an economic decision. You get to decide, once the Singapore government is weighed in, you get to decide how much gasoline you're going to use, right? So you have a lot of discretion in that. They've just said, here's what's going to happen. You need to pay this much. So on this who decides, it's really a question of how much private discretion will the government allow? How much private discretion? So let's go for low private discretion. And high private discretion. Over here, we would put regulations. We would put government direct control, government direct ownership. So where do our parks come from? Why do we have parks? That's an environmental amenity. Why do we have them? Because the government decided we would. I'm sorry, I interrupted somebody. Sorry? That's why, yes. Where did they come from? How do we have them? Because the government said that land is going to be parked. We own that land, and we're dedicating it to park. Why are there parks in the U.S.? The federal government decided we need parks for the people. It's government land, we're keeping it. In some cases, it went out and bought land that it thought was especially valuable for parks, right? Government ownership. But it doesn't all have to be that way. It could be the government coming along and saying, we'd like you to change your behavior. And it has a lot of tools for doing that without forcing it. It has tax marginal allowances where it goes, look, you decide how much you reduce, but you're going to pay, but lots of discretion. Or even, we'll pay you, right? When the government wants us to purchase, and I'm thinking the US in particular, when the government wants us to purchase solar photovoltaic panels to produce electricity, does it say you have to go out and buy it? No, it says we'll give you some money. We'll give you an incentive. We'll pay you to buy solar photovoltaic panels and put them on your house. This was huge in England when I was living there last year, and it was an uproar when the offer ended. You know, all these homeowners wanted to go out and buy solar photovoltaics. They go, oh no, they're dropping the offer. What do we call that policy tool when the government says, we'll pay for it if you do it? It's a subsidy. It's a subsidy. Education is subsidized. Our good environmental acts are subsidized. Actually, I don't know if your education is subsidized. So what we have is policy tools at this end and at that end. Now the second question is who pays? And here we have to ask an important question, which is who pays for what? Because there's two kinds of costs associated with environmental problems. One is, who's going to pay to clean it up, to reduce emissions? The second one is, who's going to bear the cost of the pollution that's not cleaned up? Right? Now, we often pay a lot of attention to that question of who's going to pay to clean it up, but we don't pay so much attention to who's going to pay for it, for what doesn't get cleaned up. But that's really important. And so if we were to say, up at this end, we've got government paying for cleanup, we use CU, and society bears residual, R-E-S-I-D, residual costs, the costs of the pollution that doesn't get cleaned up. Then down here, we could have private pays cleanup, and private pays residual costs. Right? Now let's try and fill in this with some of these instruments. Here, we can have an emissions tax. So what do you say? What are you saying to a firm? Look, we're not going to tell you what to do. What we're going to tell you is how much you're going to pay for what you emit. So anything you emit, you've got to pay us. You're paying for the residual pollution. And the firm says, oh, that's expensive. We can at least do some cleanup fairly cheaply. So let's do as much as pays us to clean up on our own, and then we'll pay the tax for the stuff that we just can't clean up. Okay? So they're paying for both kinds of costs. They're paying for cleanup, and they're paying for what they didn't clean up. At the other end, we've got the government saying to society, or I'm sorry, government saying to a firm, to a polluter, we're not going to force this, but if you would consider cleaning up, we'll pay you to do that. Okay? We'll pay you to adopt these new methods. And so here we have a subsidy. Over here, we have government operations, where the government says, we're going to decide and we're going to pay. So this is the U.S. Forest Service. This is the Park Service. And so the government is just, it's even cleanup of hazardous waste sites. Because the government has decided in some cases, we're going to just do the cleanup. We're going to control it, we're going to decide how it's done, and we're going to pay for it. Because it has to be done quickly. And then they actually do try and go out and extract money from those who are responsible later. It's another issue. Now, what about command and control regulation? That's the government saying, you're polluting. We don't like that. It's damaging the environment. We don't want you to do it. And we're not going to make you stop it. But we're going to tell you that you have to install certain kinds of equipment. You have to adopt certain kinds of practices. If you don't do that, we're shutting you down. But if you do that, we don't care that there's still some pollution left. You just need to do what we tell you to. Where does that fit in this space? I would suggest, is it over here, high private discretion? No, it's low private discretion. Is it the private party is paying for reducing emissions, cleaning up its pollution, and paying for what's left over? Well, they are paying for the equipment. They do have to adopt the practices. They're not doing this. In between here is something where we have private pays and society bears the cost of the residual. And we can put certain types of regulations here. Command and control regulation here. How about over here? Is there something in between these two? Sure. There's something where the government says, we're going to give you lots of discretion. We're not going to pay you to clean up. But we're not going to make you pay us for what you didn't clean up. We're going to tell you, for example, remarkable allowances, right? We're going to allow 20 million, this is what we did in 1990. We're going to allow 20 million tons of SO2, sulfur dioxide emissions, from electric utilities, coal-burning electric utilities. We're going to give it away to grandfathering, call it. We're going to I don't know why they don't call it grandmothering, because it seems more like what my grandmother used to say. Here, let me give this to you, right? My grandfather was all like, but we're going to give it to you, and but you have to stick within that. You're going to have to pay for any cleanup to stay within your allowances. If you want to buy allowance, you can trade allowances, lots of discretion, right? Buy allowances, cleanup, up to you, just so we don't have more than this aggregate amount. So this would be a grandfathered marketable allowance. Now, what I want you to look at on that third list, I've only taken, how many is that? 5? By the way, let me just touch on this very quickly. What goes there? We don't know. That's actually true. We don't know what goes there because we've never seen one. When I first started writing about this back in the late 90s, I made a footnote that said that in Harry Potter, there's an evil lord so terrible, so terrifying, that they don't even dare to name him, right? You know who I'm talking about, right? They won't even speak his name. This is the Voldemort of instruments, right? It's the one where the government says, here's what you're going to do. You're going to pay for it. And by the way, you're also going to pay for what you didn't do. Right? We don't have anything like that. I've never seen that policy instrument. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I've never actually observed it in practice. Okay. So there are other policy instruments listed even in that third column. So over here under people don't care, instruments to address this issue, that second column. There's a lot more instruments than just this, but I would suggest to you they're all variations. So I've gone through 4 dimensions here. D1, what's the fundamental problem? D2, what role will the government take? D3, who's going to decide how to reduce pollution, how to protect the environment? And 4, who's going to pay for it? And it doesn't matter which one of these 3 fundamental problems you have. You need to go through all 4 of those steps to get down. So oftentimes, economists especially, I'm an economist, okay, I should start with that. My doctorate was in applied economics. But God, they can be so dense sometimes when it comes to the real world. And so no, really. And they'll talk about, in great detail, they'll talk about all of these instruments and much more. And then they'll go, oh yeah. And then there's R&D, and then there's information programs. So they go like, there's all of these, because we're economists and we really like things that get in incentives. But then they treat this as if it's one thing. And the fact of the matter is you can go through those same D2, passive versus active, who pays and who decides, whether you're talking about research and innovation or information. This issue of how complex it can be for the government to not only get off the dime and say we've got an environmental problem here, but to identify why we have an environmental problem. What role should the government take? And what policy instruments should it use to intervene? And these decisions about which ones to use can be motivated by cost effectiveness, economic efficiency, by administrative ease, by the requirement. If you look at this, subsidies require us to raise revenue. We've got to go out and increase taxes somewhere else so we can pay those subsidies. You know what the beauty is of taxes, right? You're taxing a bad thing. You can actually reduce taxes on good things that you want to encourage, like labor. And this is a big deal in the US. We could actually improve our system of public finance by taxing carbon dioxide emissions at no cost to the economy. We could make a reduction of 7% in our emissions without any economic cost. But we're so locked into our ideological separations over this. So I was invited to write an editorial on this, one of these pro-con things, right? And I never mentioned climate change, right? Didn't talk about climate change. I just said, we can improve our system of public finance purely by taxing something other than what we want to encourage. Up to a point. It becomes a problem if you try to do too much, but up to a point, no cost. And because of the reduced taxes on labor, you get more jobs. If the problem is no one